Right, guys, in this video, what I want to be thinking about is, well, we're starting to think about development. Now, what we should all be comfortable with now is that we measure how developed a country is through the Human Development Index, the HDI. Now, the HDI is measured by three different factors. We're looking at adult literacy rates to measure education standards. We're looking at income levels across the country, and we're looking at life expectancy, which can be a sort of measure health, if you like. Now, if you're developing, what it basically means is that what you're doing is you are pushing up your Human Development Index score. Well, that means that education is becoming better, it means that healthcare and life expectancy are improving, and income levels are starting to grow. Okay, now what we're looking at mainly in this topic are the developing economies. So these are the ones that have got very low Human Development Index scores. I think it's worth pointing out, though, that we've got developing and we've got emerging economies. Developing economies are the ones with a very low HDI scores, which don't really be seeming to make any significant improvements over time. So these tend to be your economies in places like sub-Saharan Africa. But then you've also got the emerging economies, the ones that they've moved away from being really low HDI, and they're moving towards maybe not the standards of really developed economies, but they're moving away and improving their economic development. I'm thinking here about countries like China, India, Brazil, Mexico. Ones that emerged 30 years ago or so will be countries such as Thailand and South Korea. And they've now got a much better standard of economic development because of it. Measuring development is very difficult to do. We've got the Human Development Index, but it's by no means perfect. If you're going to truly measure development, you'd need to look at thousands of bits of statistics for the country. But to be honest, gathering that data is so difficult. The HDI does give us a rough idea of how well developed an economy is. Now, what I would say from the word go then, if we're looking at developing economies, those really, really poor ones, what have they got to do to grow? On the board here, what you've got are a lot of different things which a lot of people say are important, but we're also going to be thinking about why these things are difficult. These poor developing economies, what I would say is they're all very different. They've all got very, very different problems. Okay, they haven't all got the same issue, they might have different issues, which means they all will need different solutions to the problem. But one thing that's widely accepted is that if you want to develop, you've got to promote economic growth. Well, think about why growth is so important. Growth is about more GDP, more output. The more output you've got, well, ultimately, the more wages you can pay people, the more funds you've got to invest into capital to boost productivity, improve infrastructure. Money is needed through growth to fund economic development. Right, now what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with the ROSTO model. Now, the problem is that in many developing economies, they're stuck in what we call a low-level equilibrium trap. Many people are often employed in very low-paid agricultural work. They'll be farming that land mainly by their hand, and there could even be subsistence farmers. Okay, now the problem these guys have got is that because they're not very productive, they earn very low incomes because they lack the capital to boost that productivity. And because they've got low incomes, they can't afford to save. And if they're not saving, then it means that banks haven't got the funds available to reinvest back into the economy to boost capital. So when you think about it, these economies need capital to improve productivity to earn more money. That will enable them to save. But they can't do any of that because they haven't got the capital in the first place. So they get stuck poor. Well, what the ROSTO model is basically saying is there are 5 different stages to develop. In stage 1, you are basically stuck in your low-level equilibrium track, relying heavily on primary sector work. To escape it, what you've got to do, you've got to escape your low-level equilibrium trap. In other words, boost your productivity through more capital, which can allow you to farm your land more productively, maybe save more money, which can be used to reinvest. This could lead to new industries being created, which can create more manufacturing jobs. And that will encourage more people to move away from poor rural countryside areas towards big cities, earn more money, and before you know it, you become like a country like Great Britain. The problem with the ROSTO model, though, is it doesn't really tell you anything about what you've got to do to grow and develop. It just tells you, so it tells you what you've got to do, but how you go about doing it. How do you actually escape that low-level equilibrium trap? The Lewis model, well, it's very similar, really. It's a model based on industrialization. Now, what Lewis says, again, in many poor countries, they're very reliant on primary, which is very rural sector-based work, low paid, low productivity. But on these farms, due to a lack of opportunities elsewhere, the farms are often, there's too many people working them. So there's lots of underemployment. So what Lewis would say is, well, if you took some of these people off the land, then it wouldn't really affect the production of the farms. If anything, what it will do is mean the existing people have got more work to do, so they can become more productive and earn more money. So when you get this surplus labour away from the farm, you've got to give them an alternative. And what Lewis would say is that governments have got to somehow create manufacturing growth, create industrialisation, to encourage people to leave the farms to go live and work in the big cities to earn more money, get better paid jobs, they've got more savings to escape again that low-level equilibrium trap. The problem with the Lewis model, though, is it's how do you actually kickstart that growth? Can the governments fund that development or not? Can they get that industry up and running? Would it create inequality between the rural sector, which might be dying or not doing very well, and the urban sector, which is growing? But to me, the biggest problem has got to be linked to shanty towns. In developing economies, the big cities are poor. So when you have this big influx of people from the countryside, where are they going to live? Where they're going to work, how they're going to get around the country. Can the infrastructure like the water supplies cope with that big number of people? Well, possibly not. So you get this big growth in shanty towns where people are forced to live in makeshift homes. It's not really good for development. Haridoma. Again, it's about trying to escape this low-level equilibrium trap. In poor countries, you've got a savings gap. Not enough people save money, basically, which means banks can't reinvest that money back into the economy to create growth and development. Well, why is the low savings rates in poor countries? Well, the problem is that people simply don't earn enough money to save in the first place a lot of the time. But on top of that, another problem is that if you do save, you probably don't trust financial services. You don't trust the banks to look after your money properly. So it's stuffed at home somewhere where no one knows it is, which means it can't be reinvested back in. But if you can somehow get more people to save, what this will do will create more ability for banks to invest, which can be used to boost capital. Again, boost productivity, boost wages, help growth, create multiplier effects. But the problem with this model is, well, first of all, how do you boost savings? How can poor people save? How do you get people to trust banks? And then what we're doing, we're assuming as well that there are investment opportunities available in that economy. It's not always possible these things exist. The World Bank, they've got a different approach. They're saying that what poor economies need to do is to become what they call more market friendly. In other words, reduce the role of the government in the workings of the economy. Okay, and the idea would be what that will do, it will allow more private firms to grow and flourish, which will boost their competitiveness. But that might allow them to sort of develop export markets, for example, become more efficient, which can be used to improve wages at some point in the future. But what they've got to do as well, they've got to develop human capital. Invest if they can into things like education and skills to boost the productivity of workers. On top of that one as well, they need to be promoting stability across their economy. Firms love stability, constant solid inflation rates, low unemployment, positive growth, confidence. It makes them want to invest. The more stable they can make their economy, the better. And the last thing with this one as well was about global linkages. In other words, opening yourself up to international trade, developing comparative advantages, importing what you can't do yourself. That's the idea anyway. Now, the next one is about population growth. This was a Thomas Malthus theory. And what he said was that over time, that if I just draw a little basic graph, is that population will grow, but there's kind of a ceiling, if you like, on the resources of a country, and population can only grow up to them resources. Now, the red line will shift up over time. You do become more efficient, more productive. If you go beyond the resources of your economy, you are going to suffer from lower development. So you can take two things from this. You can either say, well, economies need to boost their productivity, boost their resources, so there's more to go around, or what they could be doing is looking at population control. Now, we're not talking about killing people off here. We're not talking about, the age of 60 killing people. A long life expectancy is a good thing for development. But over time, if population gets too big, it can create problems, not enough to go around. So maybe, introducing policies to reduce how many children people have is not a bad idea. So contraception, limits on how many children people can have, for example, changing people's beliefs and values and how many kids are important. Now, luckily, this is changing over time anyway. People used to have lots of children. The reason was there was high death rates amongst kids, high infant mortality. As these things improve, then people are starting to have less children. That might mean that women were able to go look for work and more money, and there's less mouths to feed as well. Now, the other thing is about that growth needs to be sustainable. What we do today should only really create positive impacts to people in the future. The trouble is, in many developing economies, development and growth might actually be based on exploiting your natural resources for first. So, for example, as you grow, you start to exploit those natural resources to fund industry, fuel industry, if you like, create the commodities that you need to manufacture in your economy. You might be ripping out the trees through logging, for example, which kills your rainforest, your forest, for example. You might be exploiting the atmosphere, creating lots of pollution. The trouble is, this is a great way of creating growth, but it's not that sustainable. So developing economies need to find ways of creating growth, which will only lead to benefit of people in the future. Another big problem is trying to move away from primary sector work. It's low productivity, it doesn't earn massive amounts of cash, and when it's exported, we're actually finding that many of these poor countries that export these primary products, they're suffering from lower terms of trade. In other words, for their exports, they're now earning less foreign currency. So the value of their exports are basically falling over time, which means that their primary exports are not earning as much money as what they once did. Well, why are they stuck on primary produce? Well, big problem is, if it's international, it's probably what their comparative advantage at production is. But on top of that as well, it's difficult to move away from it. The ROSTO model talks about moving away from primary towards more manufacturing work. But the problem is, how do you do it? You often need money. Now, the problem is that many people, when they take out loans to fund investment opportunities, they need to have collateral. Put down some kind of, attach a loan to your property, for example, or land that you might own. Because in many developing economies, the land ownership is not really, it's difficult to prove. Many land is passed down from father to son to next generation, for example, and there is no evidence they own that piece of land. There's no evidence of land ownership. There's no way that they can actually prove that they own it, which means that when they go to the bank, getting older credit becomes a lot more difficult. On top of that as well, the tenancy of the land. Quite often that many poor rural workers across developing economies, they work on the system, they sharecrop, so sharecropping. Now what this means is they are subsistence farmers, and they farm their land, and a percentage of what they produce will go to the landowner as rent in effect. Now think about what that means now. If they were to invest in capital, they wouldn't be benefiting themselves, to be benefiting their landlord as well. It takes away some of the incentives to invest in some of these different things. So again, this could take away the incentive to want to invest, even if the money was there to do so. Now the last one is about the government. And it's about government corruption. The more corrupt a government is, the more difficult it is to create growth and development in that economy. So what data shows is that countries that have got apparently corrupt governments of people, countries like Ethiopia, Uganda, Bangladesh, India to a certain extent. And the problem what this means, it's very difficult to do business in these economies. Again, it will hold back development and growth. Now, overall, when you look at these points then, guys, if you were looking about how you grow, well, it's all about trying to move away towards more manufacturing work, away from the primary sector. Reducing corruption in your government to make people want to invest. It's about controlling population growth, promoting sustainability, promoting savings, boosting productivity, creating competition, developing people and their skills. Now up here you've got lots and lots of different strategies. Trouble is doing this stuff is very, very difficult to do. So what this hopefully is give you an idea of what needs to happen to create development in these economies across the world.